A young woman, preparing for the happiest chapter of her life. She had chosen names, picked out clothes, and dreamed of holding her baby for the very first time. But just weeks before her due date, those dreams were shattered in a way that shocked even seasoned investigators. The scene they walked into was something no one was prepared to see. It wasn't just the loss of a mother. It was the silencing of two lives at once. Who could be responsible for such a devastating end? Was this the result of a sudden act of rage or a plan carried out with chilling intent? As the truth slowly unraveled, the story revealed not just the darkness of a single individual, but the fragile threads of trust, love, and danger that had been building long before that summer day in Illinois. In this documentary, we step into the life of Liese Dodd, a daughter, a friend, and a soon-to-be mother, whose story reminds us how quickly joy can turn into tragedy. But this is not just her story. It is also the story of the man accused of ending her life, DeAndrea Holloway, and a storm that followed his path. From childhood histories to the final days before everything collapsed, this case will take us deep into a relationship marked by passion, volatility, and ultimately, heartbreak. Stay with us as we uncover the twists, the questions, and the disturbing details that left a community searching for answers and justice. In the quiet river town of Alton, Illinois, there was a young woman whose life was filled with ordinary beauty. Her name was Liese Dodd. For those who loved her, she wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was light, laughter, and above all, hope for the future. But what makes this story so devastating is that just when her life was about to enter its most meaningful chapter, that light was suddenly and violently taken away. This is not just the story of a crime. It is the story of a daughter, a friend, and a mother-to-be. A woman with dreams, with struggles, with an entire future carefully unfolding. To understand the tragedy, we must first understand the person at the center of it. Liese grew up in Illinois, the daughter of Heidi Noel. Her mother was more than just a parent. She was a confidant, a guide, and in many ways Liese's anchor in the world. Those who knew the two of them often said their relationship was not just mother and daughter, but best friends. Heidi described Liese as my baby girl, not in a childish way, but in a way that reflected a bond that could never be broken. From her earliest days, Liese carried with her an energy that drew people in. She was the kind of child who, even when shy, had a presence that made others feel comfortable. Teachers noticed it. Classmates felt it. Friends remembered it years later. In school, Liese was remembered not just for her bright smile, but for her ability to listen. Friends described her as the person you could call at 2 a.m., the one who wouldn't judge, but would simply sit with you, even if all you could do was cry. She had hobbies, of course. Music she loved, clothes she carefully picked out, laughter she shared freely. But what defined her was kindness. It wasn't grand gestures, it was the little things, the notes she'd leave for friends, the way she remembered details others might forget, the care she showed when no one else seemed to notice. This is who she was, not the headline, not the crime, but a human being. Flesh, blood, and heart. As she entered early adulthood, Liese, like so many young people, was still finding her way. She had dreams, but also doubts. She stumbled, but she always found her footing again. She talked often about wanting stability, about wanting a family of her own someday. She wanted a life where love and safety could exist side by side. And then came the chapter she had been waiting for: pregnancy. At just 22 years old, Liese found out she was going to be a mother. And from the moment she saw that test, her world shifted. She shared the news with her mother, Heidi. For Heidi, the idea of becoming a grandmother was overwhelming, joyful, emotional, and surreal. For Liese, the anticipation was almost indescribable. She threw herself into preparing. She began decorating the nursery. She talked endlessly about names, about what kind of mother she wanted to be, about how she wanted to raise her child with patience and warmth. Her friends recall that she seemed more alive than ever. She radiated. This wasn't just about having a baby. This was about building the future she had always hoped for. But beneath the surface of her joy was a shadow. Because as much as she dreamed of a safe and nurturing future, there were forces in her life that would threaten all of it. And yet, she carried on. She pushed forward. She smiled through uncertainty, believing that love and life were worth more than fear. Her story is not defined by the ending. It is defined by the way she lived, by the way she loved. But for the sake of understanding, for the sake of truth, we cannot stop here. To fully understand what happened, we must also look at the people who surrounded her, the relationships that lifted her up, and the one relationship that would ultimately lead her into danger.
Every tragedy has two stories, the one we mourn and the one we struggle to understand. To grasp how Liese Dodd's life was stolen, we must step into the world of the man accused of taking it. A world shaped by instability, shadowed by inner battles, and marked by choices that would ultimately collide with hers in the most devastating way. This is the story of Deandra Holloway. Deandra Holloway was born and raised in Litchfield, Illinois, a community that outwardly seemed quiet, familiar, and unremarkable. Yet for Holloway, childhood was anything but steady. Those close to him describe a home that carried its own weight of struggles. His family faced economic instability, and the day-to-day rhythm of life was often shaped more by survival than stability. While Litchfield was the kind of town where neighbors knew one another, Deandra's early years revealed cracks that few fully saw, or perhaps chose not to look too closely at. Family dynamics played a central role in shaping who Holloway would become. Accounts suggest his relationship with his parents was strained, marked not so much by absence but by friction. His parents, like many, carried their own burdens, and within that environment, Deandra often felt the weight of frustration, of not fitting in, of not measuring up. For children in homes where affection and discipline do not walk in hand, the results can be unpredictable. Some adapt, finding resilience. Others struggle, drifting toward anger and volatility. Holloway seemed to lean toward the latter. In school, Deandra's presence was complicated. Teachers remember him as intelligent, even quick-witted at times. But alongside that potential came disruption. Reports from his school years paint a picture of disciplinary problems, conflicts with authority, episodes of aggression, and a refusal to follow structure. What could have been chalked up to typical teenage rebellion soon began to look more concerning. Peers recall moments when Holloway could be charismatic, smiling, joking, even fitting in with ease. But then, in a flash, that charm could turn sharp, confrontational, and unpredictable. Those swings, those extremes, stood out. They were the first cracks in a foundation that was already unstable. As Holloway grew older, the struggles sharpened. Later courtroom testimony and psychiatric evaluations would reveal a battle with mental health that had gone largely untreated for years. Witnesses described erratic behavior, sudden rants, and what some called talking to himself. Holloway allegedly spoke of hearing voices, of feeling pushed by forces others could not see. It is critical to understand mental illness does not excuse violence, but when left untreated, when paired with anger, isolation, and instability, it can create a dangerous storm. Holloway's mind seemed to live in that storm, and those closest to him, friends, neighbors, even passing acquaintances, caught glimpses of it long before tragedy struck. Among his peers, Holloway was a puzzle. Some saw him as magnetic, a young man capable of winning trust, cracking a joke, carrying himself with confidence. Others warned of his volatility, describing him as unpredictable, prone to snapping without warning. In relationships, that same contradiction appeared. Stories of charm were quickly counterbalanced by accounts of control, of tension, of sudden bursts of anger that left partners walking on eggshells. Holloway's life was not defined by consistency. It was defined by contradiction. And it was that contradiction that made him both approachable and dangerous. Before Liese Dodd ever entered his life, Holloway had already crossed paths with law enforcement. Nothing as severe as what would eventually unfold, but enough to set off alarms. Small arrests, reports of confrontations, complaints from those who said that Holloway's temper burned too hot, too fast. Each encounter was like a spark, a warning flare shot into the night sky. But as is often the case, those flares faded, dismissed as isolated incidents. In hindsight, the question lingers: were these early warnings ignored? Or were they simply too scattered, too subtle to connect the dots? When Liese Dodd and Deandra Holloway's paths finally crossed, they came from two very different worlds. Hers filled with light, his clouded by shadows. What drew them together? Was it charm? Was it vulnerability? Or was it simply the human need to be seen? The answers remain debated, but what cannot be denied is that from their meeting forward, the trajectory of both their lives would be forever altered. For Liese, it meant heartbreak and ultimately tragedy. For Holloway, it meant spiraling further into a darkness that had been building since childhood. And for us, trying to understand, it means asking not just what happened, but how the warning signs were missed along the way. When two people cross paths, the story that follows can be one of love, hope, and possibility. But sometimes, what begins as a spark of connection slowly unravels into something far darker. The story of Liese Dodd and Deandra Holloway is one such path, a relationship that promised companionship, but instead became a storm that threatened to consume everything in its way. Their meeting was ordinary, almost unremarkable at first glance. Two young people navigating the uncertainties of adulthood in a small Illinois community. Liese, with her warm smile and an openness that drew others toward her, and Deandra, with an initial charm that could be disarming. Friends would later recall that he had a way of making his presence felt, sometimes magnetic, sometimes unsettling. In those early days, the connection between them felt real. For Liese, who believed in seeing the good in others, the relationship seemed like a chance at companionship, at stability. For Deandra, it was perhaps a fleeting anchor in a life marked by chaos and instability. But as anyone close to Liese would later admit, the relationship never quite followed the steady course of a true partnership. It was marked by cycles, bursts of affection and calm, followed by arguments that seemed to come out of nowhere. Breakups, reconciliations, promises made and promises broken. This on and off cycle was something her family noticed, something her friends worried about. Yet, like so many in complicated relationships, Liese held on to hope that things could improve. In the early honeymoon phase, Deandra showed his most likable side. He was attentive, engaging, even persuasive. It wasn't difficult to see how Liese, with her trusting nature, could be drawn in. But as weeks turned into months, small cracks began to show. Moments of frustration that escalated too quickly. Comments that sounded more like control than care. Times when his behavior flipped without warning. 1 minute affectionate, the next distant or irritable. Friends noticed. Some quietly pulled Liese aside, warning her to take a step back, to think carefully about whether this was healthy. Her mother Heidi picked up on the unease too. She knew her daughter was strong-willed, but also deeply compassionate, sometimes to the point of giving second chances where none were deserved. For Liese, the idea of walking away was never simple. She wanted to believe people could change. And then came the pregnancy. A turning point. For Liese, it was pure joy. The excitement of preparing for motherhood, of imagining the life growing inside her. She threw herself into the preparations, the nursery, the tiny clothes, the dreams of first steps and first birthdays. Friends and family remember her radiant smile when she spoke about the baby. It was the future she wanted, the chapter she was ready to embrace. But for Holloway, the pregnancy was something else. The child was not his, and this fact became a wedge he could not ignore. What for Liese represented new beginnings, for him became a symbol of rejection, of jealousy, of slipping control. His emotions, already unstable, shifted into something darker. His words grew sharper, his behavior more erratic. The relationship, never steady to begin with, spiraled in those final weeks. Liese's family noticed the growing distance. Her friends sensed her unease. Arguments became more frequent, tension more visible. There were moments when she spoke about wanting to move on, to leave behind the cycle and focus on her baby. She wanted stability, not chaos. Love, not fear. But Holloway was not prepared to let go. In his world, control mattered more than compassion. The thought of losing her, not just to someone else, but to a life that excluded him, seemed to send him deeper into the volatility that marked his every step. And in this,
as the days drew closer to her due date, Liese was looking ahead with cautious optimism. She spoke with excitement about her future as a mother, even while navigating the stress of her unstable relationship. It was clear to those around her that she was at a crossroads, one path leading toward renewal and new life, the other shadowed by the destructive presence of a man unwilling to let her move forward. And in this fragile, uncertain balance, the seeds of tragedy had already been planted. Theirs was not just the story of two people in a troubled relationship. It was the story of what happens when hope collides with instability, when compassion meets volatility, and when the future one person dreams of becomes the nightmare another cannot accept. Liese wanted a new chapter. Holloway, consumed by jealousy and unraveling control, was already writing the ending in his mind. The question, looming like a storm over everything, was whether Liese would find the strength to step fully away, or whether Holloway's downward spiral would catch her in its grip. June 9, 2022. It was supposed to be an ordinary summer day in Alton, Illinois, but by the end of it, the quiet neighborhood where Liese Dodd lived would never look the same again. The morning began with unanswered calls. Liese's mother, Heidi Noel, tried reaching her daughter, at first casually, then with increasing worry. Texts went unread. Hours passed and silence grew heavier. At first, Heidi told herself it was nothing unusual. After all, Liese was preparing for a new chapter in life. A young woman expecting a child. She often had errands, appointments, or simply needed rest. But a mother knows when something feels off. And on that day, Heidi couldn't shake the sense that something was very wrong. By early afternoon, Heidi drove to her daughter's apartment. She walked up the narrow steps, expecting perhaps to find Liese resting
or maybe frustrated with phone trouble. But as she opened the door, the weight of dread became unbearable. What she discovered inside was a reality no mother should ever face. The moment Heidi realized the truth, the world seemed to collapse around her. A call was placed, one filled with panic, disbelief, and devastation. Within minutes, the first Alton police officers arrived. They were met not only with a crime scene, but with an atmosphere so emotionally charged, even seasoned investigators felt the weight of what had just unfolded. This was not just another case. This was a young woman, full of hope, preparing to welcome a child whose life had been violently cut short. And for officers tasked with protecting the community, the scene was one of those moments that stays with them forever. Detectives worked quickly. Calls for backup went out, and soon the quiet street was filled with law enforcement vehicles. Neighbors stood behind the tape, whispering to one another, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The investigation moved fast because there was already a name that came up almost immediately: DeAndrea Holloway. Holloway had been in an on-and-off relationship with Liese for years. Their history was marked by turbulence, jealousy, and heated arguments that friends and family had long worried about. And in the hours before her mother discovered the crime, Holloway's behavior had already drawn concern. As officers began piecing together what happened, one fact became clear: they needed to find Holloway, and fast. Later that same day, in the nearby town of Gillespie, Illinois, Holloway was located. His arrest was swift, but even in handcuffs, his demeanor unsettled those who witnessed it. Witnesses described him as alternating between calm and unhinged, muttering to himself, sometimes smirking, as though he failed to grasp the gravity of what had just occurred. At an evening press conference, the Alton police chief addressed the public. His words carried both sorrow and disbelief. He noted that even among seasoned investigators, this was one of the most shocking and emotionally devastating cases they had ever worked. The pain was evident not only in the family, but in the entire community. The story quickly made headlines, not just in Alton, but across the nation. A young mother-to-be robbed of her future, a family shattered, and a perpetrator already in custody, facing charges that would reverberate through the courtroom for years to come. As night fell, neighbors placed flowers, teddy bears, and candles near the apartment. The flickering lights illuminated handwritten notes, each one carrying a message of sorrow, love, or disbelief. Some were from close friends, others from strangers who simply couldn't bear the thought of such loss happening in their community. But underneath the grief, there was also anger and questions. How had things escalated so far? Could anything have been done to prevent this tragedy? And most haunting of all, why did Holloway's downward spiral end here in such an unthinkable way? Those questions would form the backbone of the investigation, the trial, and the public conversation that followed. But on that night, as Alton tried to sleep, there was no answer, only silence, broken by the hum of patrol cars still circling the block, ensuring the safety of a shaken community. The crime of June 9, 2022, was more than an act of violence. It was a turning point, a moment that exposed the fragility of safety, the devastation of domestic turmoil, and the enduring strength of a community determined to honor the memory of one of its own. And as Holloway sat behind bars that night, the weight of what he had done began to ripple outward from the home where it happened, to the courthouse where justice would be sought, and into the hearts of all who heard Liese's story.
When the first shock passed, law enforcement shifted their focus to a single, urgent question: who could have carried out something so devastating? From the very beginning, suspicion fell on one person: Liese's on-again, off-again partner, Andrew Holloway. Their relationship had been riddled with turbulence, and investigators quickly discovered a troubling pattern of arguments, jealousy, and obsession. But suspicion alone was not enough. Detectives needed proof, hard evidence that could hold up in court. The investigation began with forensics. Specialists scoured Liese's home, searching for anything: fingerprints, fibers, digital footprints that could tell the story her voice no longer could. Every corner of the residence was treated as a silent witness. Tiny fragments, invisible to the naked eye, held the potential to bring answers. Meanwhile, detectives were piecing together the last 24 hours of Liese's life. Phone records, text messages, and social media interactions became a crucial roadmap. It didn't take long before patterns began to emerge. In the days leading up to June 9th, the communication between Liese and Holloway painted a clear picture of escalating conflict. Interviews added another layer. Friends described Liese as hopeful about the future, but increasingly exhausted by Holloway's volatility. Family members recalled heated phone calls, emotional outbursts, and a sense that Liese was trying to pull away. Every testimony seemed to point in the same direction, but still, detectives needed the one thread that tied Holloway beyond doubt to the crime. Then came the breakthrough. Investigators discovered Holloway's movements on June 9th did not align with his statements. Surveillance footage combined with GPS data raised red flags. Small inconsistencies became glaring contradictions. Holloway wasn't where he claimed to be. But even this wasn't the final piece. What tied everything together was something no one could have anticipated. Days after the tragedy, Holloway found himself in police custody, not for murder, but for something far more mundane. He had been arrested for stealing a bicycle. To outsiders, it seemed like a trivial charge, almost absurd compared to the magnitude of the investigation surrounding him. But in that moment, law enforcement saw their opening. Through this unrelated arrest, authorities were able to question Holloway further, probe his timeline, and dig deeper into his inconsistencies. What began as a petty crime became the crack that widened the door, allowing investigators to connect him directly to Liese's death. With Holloway in custody, forensic evidence, digital records, and witness testimony all began to converge. Piece by piece, the picture became undeniable. He wasn't just connected to the crime, he was at the center of it. The charges escalated quickly. He now faced accusations not only of taking Liese's life, but also of ending the life of her unborn child. To make matters worse, evidence suggested attempts at concealment, an effort to mislead and obstruct justice. The weight of the charges captured national attention. News outlets across the country picked up the story. Headlines highlighted the horror, the loss of 2 lives in one act, and the haunting question of how such darkness could emerge from a small-town relationship. For many in the community, the coverage felt like a mirror reflecting their own grief and disbelief. Candlelight vigils sprang up almost immediately. Strangers gathered shoulder to shoulder, holding flickering lights against the darkness, mourning a woman and a child who would never see tomorrow. Detectives worked tirelessly, knowing the case was more than evidence. It was about restoring trust, offering a community a sense of closure, and giving Liese and her unborn child the justice they deserved. Behind closed doors, investigators described the weight they carried. Even seasoned officers admitted the case shook them in ways few others had. The emotional toll was real, but so was the resolve. This was no longer just a crime scene. It had become the story of a life cut short, of a future erased, and of a town left searching for answers. By the time the case was formally built, Holloway's arrest for something as small as a bicycle theft had transformed into one of the most chilling criminal prosecutions in recent memory. The irony was not lost on anyone. A man accused of taking something trivial was now facing the heaviest accusations the law could bring. And for the community of Staunton, the investigation marked the beginning of a long, painful journey, one that would carry them from shock and grief toward the search for justice.
The wheels of justice often move slowly. For the family of Beverly Lambert, those wheels moved at a pace that felt almost unbearable. What began in June of 2022 as a shocking act of violence soon transformed into a drawn-out legal process that tested patience, resolve, and faith in the system itself. In the days following his arrest, prosecutors made their intentions clear. Holloway would face multiple charges, the gravest among them the murder of Beverly Lambert, the death of her unborn child, and the attempted concealment of his crimes. Each charge carried its own weight, but together they painted a picture of someone who had not only taken a life, but also shattered futures that would never come to be. Yet even in moments where the path forward seemed direct, the story twisted once again. When Holloway first appeared in court, his demeanor raised immediate questions. His speech was disjointed, his answers erratic. A court-appointed psychologist was called in, and the conclusion was staggering. Holloway was unfit to stand trial. For Beverly's family, this decision was agonizing. Instead of answers, they were met with uncertainty. Instead of a trial, they faced an indefinite delay. Holloway was sent away for treatment, an effort to restore his competency. But as weeks turned into months, the waiting became its own form of punishment. The legal system had entered a stalemate. Prosecutors built their case, witnesses prepared, but everything depended on one man's mental state. In the courtroom, silence replaced progress, and every continuance order echoed with frustration. But in the summer of 2024, the tide shifted. After extensive treatment, evaluations concluded that Holloway was fit to stand trial. The announcement sent a ripple through the community. Justice, it seemed, would finally have its day. The courtroom filled once more. Lawyers, journalists, community members, and, most importantly, Beverly's family. But just when the stage was set for what many believed would be a lengthy and grueling trial, Holloway made a move no one fully expected. He pled guilty. There would be no drawn-out cross-examinations, no endless testimony, no chance for Holloway to spin his own narrative from the witness stand. In a single, definitive moment, the case shifted from uncertainty to resolution. By January 2025, the sentencing phase brought the story to its closing act. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the decision. 60 years in prison. But there was one final twist. Holloway's sentences would run consecutively, not concurrently. This ensured that his time behind bars would not be reduced by overlapping counts. It meant decades locked away with little to no chance of release. For Beverly's loved ones, it was not the ending they wanted. No sentence could restore what was lost. No punishment could erase the pain. But it was closure, firm, resolute, and final. And so, after years of waiting, of delays and twists, the gavel came down with a lasting message. Justice may bend, but it does not break. The courtroom had grown still on the day Heidi Noel, Liese's mother, took the stand to deliver her victim impact statement. For many in attendance, this was the most emotional moment of the entire case. The facts had already been laid bare, the charges, the plea, the sentencing. But it was here, within a mother's trembling words, that the true weight of loss would be felt. Heidi spoke not only as a grieving parent, but as a voice for the future that her daughter and her unborn child would never have. Through tears, she recalled Liese's joy for life, her optimism, and her boundless compassion. Every sentence carried both heartbreak and a demand that no one forget what was taken on that June day. Her words struck every corner of the room. Even the most seasoned court officials, judges, clerks, and lawyers seemed to lower their gaze. This was grief made public, yet it carried a quiet strength. Heidi refused to let her daughter's life be reduced to a headline or a case number. Outside the courtroom, Liese's family continued to honor her the way she lived, through laughter, stories, and cherished memories. Friends recalled her light-hearted humor, her love of music, and her habit of always checking in on those around her. Though they grieved, they found comfort in remembering who she was before tragedy struck. One story often shared was how Liese, even as a child, would comfort others before herself. When friends struggled, she was the first to call, the first to bring laughter into a heavy room. That legacy of kindness and care remained even in her absence. In the days following her passing, the community gathered in grief but also in solidarity. Vigils were held in her honor, where candles flickered beneath the night sky and balloons lifted slowly into the air. Strangers stood shoulder to shoulder with family, bound together by loss, but also by a determination to ensure her memory lived on. It wasn't only the physical presence of those who attended. Across social media, thousands of posts poured in. Messages of support came from near and far, some from people who never knew Liese personally, but who felt compelled to stand with her family in spirit. In the aftermath, a GoFundMe campaign was launched to support funeral costs and future charitable donations in Liese's name. What began as a modest request quickly grew into something larger. Contributions arrived from friends, neighbors, and even strangers across the nation. Each dollar carried a message that no one should bear such a burden alone. The generosity not only eased financial weight, but also reminded the family of the vast circle of people who cared. It was proof that even in tragedy, compassion remained stronger than cruelty. But beyond the grief and tributes, something larger began to take shape. The case sparked difficult conversations about domestic violence, hidden struggles, and the need for stronger protections. Advocates reminded the public that tragedies like this rarely happen in isolation. They often come after warnings, after overlooked red flags. Local organizations reported an increase in calls and outreach from people seeking help. Survivors began sharing their own stories, emboldened by the attention the case had received. Liese's memory, in an unexpected way, became a catalyst for awareness and change. And yet, amidst the pain, a twist unfolded, not one of the courtroom, nor the investigation, but of the human spirit. The tragedy did not splinter the community as many feared. Instead, it drew them closer. Families who had never spoken before began checking in on one another. Churches, schools, and local businesses organized drives and awareness sessions. For Heidi Noel and her family, this unity was a reminder that while they had suffered an unimaginable loss, they were not alone. The community had become an extended family, carrying a portion of the burden. In the end, the impact of this case was not only measured in court sentences or legal outcomes, it was measured in the countless lives touched, the awareness raised, and the love shown in the face of heartbreak. Through every vigil, every tribute, and every spoken memory, Liese's story continues to resonate. Her life, though cut short, became a light that inspired others to look closer, to act sooner, and to hold one another tighter. And that, perhaps, is her lasting legacy.
The story of Liese Noel is not just a chronicle of tragedy.
It is a call for change, a reminder that silence can be deadly, and that the choices we make as individuals, as families, and as communities can either save a life or allow danger to grow unchecked in the shadows. When we reach the end of a case like this, the temptation is to close the book and quietly move on. But to do that would be to forget Liese, and forgetting her is not an option. Her voice was silenced, but her story speaks louder than ever. And so, I want to leave you with a question. Not a simple one, not one with an easy answer, but one that demands reflection. Was justice truly served with a 60-year sentence? On paper, it looks decisive. The man responsible will spend the majority of his life behind prison walls. But is punishment enough? Can a sentence alone heal the devastation of a family, the collapse of dreams, the loss of a future that should have been filled with lullabies, birthdays, and the simple joy of a daughter becoming a mother? This is where you, the viewer, become part of the story. Your voice matters. Your perspective, your willingness to speak, to demand better protections, to advocate for stronger systems that prevent abuse before it escalates, all of that shapes what happens next, not just in Illinois, but in every community across the country. So I ask you directly, what more can we do? What more should we do? Do you believe that laws go far enough to protect expectant mothers? Do you believe that warning signs are taken seriously enough by those around them? And do you believe that families, neighbors, and friends carry a shared responsibility to see, to act, and to protect? This is not a rhetorical plea. It is an invitation. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let your voice be part of the dialogue. Because every comment, every perspective adds weight to a growing movement, a movement that says, we will not look away, we will not let this happen again. And beyond speaking, there is action. If this story touched you, if you found yourself grieving for Liese, or for her unborn child who never got the chance to draw a breath, then let that grief be transformed into something larger. Share this video. Pass her story along, not to grow a channel, not for numbers, but to honor her memory. Every share means another person learns Liese's name. Every like ensures that her voice is amplified against the noise of an often uncaring world. Every subscription keeps alive the promise that these stories, the ones that cut deep, the ones that hold power, will continue to be told. It is easy to feel powerless when faced with tragedy. Easy to think that one person cannot shift the tide. But history shows us otherwise. Movements are born from whispers. Change begins with a single voice, and when those voices come together, refusing to be silenced, refusing to allow complacency, that is when transformation occurs. Liese had dreams. Dreams of being a mother, dreams of building a life surrounded by family and laughter. Those dreams ended far too soon, but we, together, can make sure her story lives on, not just as a warning, but as a guide, as a legacy that teaches, protects, and inspires. So I leave you with this. Take her story with you. Talk about it with your friends. Share it with your community. Reflect on what it means and how it might change the way you see the relationships around you. And when you're ready, return here to this space where stories like these are not buried, but brought to light, examined, and honored. Because silence is dangerous, but speaking can save lives. Do you believe justice was truly done for Liese? Or is there still more we must fight for?